Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Academic Bites podcast. I know it's been some time, but we are going to be rolling back out with some new content and some new episodes over the course of this year, mainly in connection with the 250th celebration of the birth of the United States after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. At YSU in particular, we're going to be hosting a variety of events. Some have already happened and will be posted on the podcast here shortly. And this is one of the episodes that we're going to talk about, which was done by the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor, hosted a film screening of the movie Deer Hunter. This was in collaboration not only with the YSU 250 events, but also Ohio Goes to the Movies. After the screening of the movie, there was a panel that actually talked about the movie to some degree. And we were lucky enough to be able to record that. So what follows now is that panel and is that discussion about the movie, both in terms of content and also the location that it was recorded. So again, look out for more content coming here shortly. But for the time being, I now present the panel done in collaboration with the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor on the movie Deer Hunter.
Okay, everyone, welcome. As I said earlier, my name is Jonathan Camboris, and I am pleased to provide to you today, to welcome our panel discussion that is sponsored by the Charles Darling Endowment, chaired by Dr. Martha Palanti. Today we have four panelists and a mentor of mine, Dr. David Simonelli, who will provide some introduction into his field specialty of history. Dr. Laura Biebling, we're looking through our program here if you need some an introduction. Dr. Biebling has taught film and screenwriting at Youngstown State University for 13 years. She has published on the films of the Coen brothers, Native American directors, and many others. As a daughter of a Vietnam veteran, she was very interested in rewatching this film that she hasn't seen since graduate school in the early 2000s. She looks forward to hearing a variety of perspectives on it. Dr. Joseph Alessi, professor of history, is a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army and native of Youngstown. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Education and Master of Arts in History from Youngstown State University and his PhD in History from St. Louis University. He completed 3 operational deployments while on active duty in the Middle East and elsewhere. His scholarship includes work on urban development, leadership, and conflict. As both a historian and veteran, he brings a unique perspective to the film's portrayal of war, service, and its lasting effects on individuals and communities. Dr. Stephanie Smith, an art historian, has been a faculty member at Youngstown State University since 1998. She earned her Bachelor of Arts in Art History from Washington and Lee University and her Master of Arts and PhD in the History of Art from Rutgers University. She teaches courses spanning Greek, Roman, Islamic, Byzantine, and modern art and architecture. Her research focuses on the ritual, commemoration, and visual culture. She looks forward to discussing the film's visual language, symbolism, and how its cinematography shapes our understanding of place and identity. Dr. Martha Palanti in history. Dr. Palanti is the Charles Darling Endowed Chair of American Social History and former chair of the YSU Department of History. She played a central role in establishing Youngstown State University, the managing partner of the Youngstown Historical Center of Industry and Labor in 2008. Under her leadership, the museum expanded student-driven public history projects, 2 of which earned the Ohio Academy of History Public History Award. As a scholar of the Mahoning Valley's industrial and social history, she brings deep and regional insight to the film's portrayal of working class and immigrant life. Please give it up for our panelists, everyone.
I hate electronics. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I'm actually here tonight not to talk as a historian, but as someone for whom the Deer Hunter, and particularly the characters portrayed in it, are part of my lived experience. I graduated from high school in 1973. Yes, that does date me. And many of the characters in this film are recognizable to me. I went to those weddings, and they looked remarkably like that. I knew most of those guys that were central to the story of the movie. And this is a movie that has affected me profoundly. I saw it in its original showing in 1978 on a break between William and Mary and the University of Pennsylvania. And I've never been able to make myself watch it again because it touches too many open sores and wounds. For me, those characters are very much alive. I knew people who came home broken from Vietnam. I knew people who didn't come home at all. And in some ways, those who didn't come home were much luckier. Maybe not luckier, that's not the right word, but much more at peace than some of the men I knew who did come home. One of the rituals in my high school, and I was in high school during the ritual of the draft lottery, was every teacher had a student who carried around a radio for the period that it went on. And for that 2 or 3 days, no one taught. Everyone in the school, including the administration, knew no one was teaching. Everyone, particularly those for whom the birth year was central, waited with bated breath to find out whether they could make plans or they should just go to the nearest selective service office. It was difficult because we knew that many of the people we grew up with would be gone as they were. Most of us knew folks who came home and were never the same. One anecdote. While I was at William and Mary, I worked on a dig site, and most of us, showed up at the last possible moment on Monday morning, and by Friday afternoon we had checked out. But there was one guy at the site. He was a little odd. His name was Chuck, not his real name, but he had been a second lieutenant in Vietnam. And Friday afternoons, we spent a lot of time sitting on the banks of the James River with 2 things that served us well: a large bottle of scotch and a block of ice, and each of us with our own coffee cup. And one afternoon, he started talking. And he never said anything other than, basically, pass me the trowel or pass me the shovel, or do you need me to move that dirt? And he was talking about his experience. He'd gone to school on an ROTC scholarship, and his deployment, after he finished his master's degree, sent him as a second lieutenant to Vietnam. His sergeant, a man who was a little bit older than he, told him as they left their encampment for their first patrol, he took him aside and said, "There are more second lieutenants killed here by friendly fire than there are anything else." And he says, "You've got 2 choices. We can go out, we can do our deployment, maybe a third of us will come back, or maybe a third of us won't come back, we'll be brought back by the others." He said, "You'll be one of them. Your other choice is to take us out far enough that no one can find us and get us up in the trees and let us stay 3 or 4 days." He said he slept 18 months in trees. Every person I knew who came back had some story. Most weren't as poignant or horrific, but they came back changed in ways that most of us can't understand. And I think that this film, although it is particularly the latter parts that are very, very difficult to watch, deserves its place in the filmography of American film. So, thank you. I'd like to introduce my colleagues. First is Dave Simonelli. He's a professor in the history department who specializes in modern European history, particularly that of English Empire, British Empire. And one of the things he's been teaching for us recently is Vietnam. And he's going to give us just a little bit of background about that. Our second speaker will be Stephanie Smith. And she confessed that she hasn't seen the film in ages, but went down a rabbit hole over the past 2 weeks.
Yeah, I've watched the first part 3 times.
So,
First hour, 3 times.
and has some very telling information to give you about the sort of imagery and the ways that things play out and reoccur in the film. Next in line is Laura Beedling. And one of the things she shares, I think that is very important with many of the folks portrayed in the film, is the fact that her father was a veteran from Vietnam, but was also a steel worker, and that her first job was actually in a steel mill. And finally, we have Joe Alessi. Joe and I go way back to the first days of my experiences here at YSU way back in 1991, and we bonded over the fact that we were sort of the department outcasts because we'd both been student athletes. So I think this is a crew that can add much to the telling of the film. One last thing I would like to leave you with, and it's something that's been playing on my mind. The men who went to Vietnam, most of them went, like the guys portrayed in The Deer Hunter, because they sensed a feeling of obligation to go and serve their country. And they believed that they were going and fighting to preserve their way of life so that they could come home and take up that life, and that the people they left behind could continue to enjoy it. When they returned from Vietnam, they found a world very changed. Rather than coming home as heroes, many came home as scorned, because by the time they returned, temperament about the war had changed, and they were seen, as illegitimate invaders, or however you want to portray them, not as conquering heroes. But they still had those jobs. In 1976, 1977, they could still embrace the fact that they had preserved their way of life. But for many of the guys who were here, many of the guys that I grew up with, one of the things that changed radically was they had their world torn down a second time. Not in Vietnam, but in the mills where they went to work every day. Black Monday in 1977 changed this place enormously. And many of the guys who lost those jobs were people who had thought they had fought to preserve their way of life. In many ways, they were dealt a double blow. And we often refer to the guys who went to World War I and came back so scarred from that experience as the lost generation. I think this film and a lot of the portrayals that come out of it really represent a generation that felt in many ways they've been tossed away. So, having said that, David.
Hi. I have been given the task with 36 hours notice of summarizing an entire 14-week semester-long course into about 10 minutes. Two, it looks like a bunch of people that actually lived through this. So hopefully none of you took vegetables over from Jonathan's reception to throw at me about this kind of stuff. I'm going to try to, quickly summarize the war and try to find sort of the context in terms of what I present to a class that these guys came from, in terms of their understanding of what it was, and some of the realities as opposed to sort of like the myths that you hear about the war in general. The Cold War spawns a lot of tragedies that haunt American life afterward, and Vietnam is perhaps the greatest of them for Americans, where, at least in a world history context, we are the world's original colonial rebel. And Vietnam was the sharpest hypocrisy, perhaps, that we ever dealt, in that we were turning around and taking a country full of people that looked at the driving out of the Japanese, the French, and us as an effort to overthrow colonialism, and we were problem number one as far as that went. And it very much changed the attitude of Americans toward our foreign policy, and really Americans toward each other ever after. It still haunts our diplomacy, our military, our politics today. So a quick summary of the deal. What Indochina in general is an area of the world that over the course of 5,500 years of world history has been between the two most prosperous civilizations on Earth, India and China. So it's an obvious focus of trade and contact and the like. And both the Indians and the Chinese colonized different parts of it multiple times over the years. This, naturally is going to lead people living in the area to want to defy the colonizers at any given time. And when you have that much practice at it, as the Vietnamese have, you're going to build a strong sense of nationalism. And that's what Westerners were confronted with when the French showed up and colonized the place in 1859. Perpetually surprised at the fact that the Vietnamese simply would not give in to them, give into colonization. Even the colonial elites, Ho Chi Minh's family was a family of colonial administrators that were simultaneously plotting the overthrow of the French over the course of some 20-odd years before Ho himself went on trips around the world. I mean, this was a very common thing. Ho Chi Minh became a communist, and more importantly, as far as most of the Vietnamese people were concerned, their most important rebel against the French. He was a hero to people up and down Vietnam that were not necessarily communists. His communism, at least as far as people in Vietnam were concerned, was secondary to his nationalism. And they followed him for that reason. I would heavily point out it was certainly not secondary to Ho Chi Minh or any of the people around him that ended up running the North Vietnamese regime. But nonetheless, that was the perception of most of these people. So, when the Second World War rolled around and we were allied with communists around the world in trying to defeat the Japanese and the Germans, the communist movement in Indochina were our allies, and we supplied the Viet Minh with money, with all kinds of weapons and the like over the course, particularly of 1945. And when the war came to an end, Ho Chi Minh rode to Hanoi in an American Jeep to announce the independence of Vietnam. A year later, the Truman administration decided that wasn't such a hot idea and was willing to allow the French to come in and recolonize the place because the Cold War was on, and suddenly this was a Cold War conflict in a way that we had not perceived it just a single year previously. When the French made their efforts to recolonize Vietnam, we ended up supplying 80% of the money that was necessary in order to bring about the conquest of the Vietnamese independence movement, and it was a failure. They were driven out in 1954. The Eisenhower administration SOP was to demand that Vietnam be separated the same way that Germany had been, the same way that Korea had been. This was the solution at the time. Put two systems of government in different parts of the country and allow them to compete against each other for the sentiments of their people. I want to strongly emphasize this. When this split occurs, between 1954 and 1955, there's about 7,000 or 8,000 people in South Vietnam that decide that they want to go and live in the place where Ho Chi Minh, the communist rebel hero, is going to be the president of the country. 750,000 people in North Vietnam picked up and left North Vietnam for the South. When what I want to point out is that the effort to fight against communism was an effort that was supported probably by a majority of the Vietnamese people. This isn't this, it wasn't as if we were going against the desires of the people that were there. It's just that in the long run, that regime in the South wasn't worth their support either. Developing as a dictatorship, we ended up having to support a coup d'etat in 1963, where President Ngo Dinh Diem was killed in this coup 3 weeks before John F. Kennedy was assassinated. We end up in a quagmire where it is very clear that to Americans and to a sizable number of Vietnamese that we are on the side of the right. But on the other hand, is the right thing to do to go in and go killing people in order to accomplish these political goals? Which is pretty much the answer to the whole of the Cold War. You can answer this in any number of different foreign policy situations that the United States ends up in. And the Vietnam is only the worst. Watching The Deer Hunter, I think it's kind of important to note in, the wedding that we saw there that, these three guys are heroes. The bartender is coming to them and telling them, geez, I would be doing this if I didn't have a niece. We know Vietnam most of the time from, protests and music. And actually the Deer Hunter itself is a reflection of the immediate post-war attitude toward the war, which is that, this was this long national nightmare that we had been involved in, that our government had pushed us into and had become corrupted as a result. The vast majority of Americans, from beginning to end, supported the Johnson and Nixon administrations in their efforts at the war. They became disillusioned with it, but they weren't about to tell people that this war was not worth fighting. They believed in the causes that the United States was trying to pursue. Communism is a rotten system. And not just a rotten system in terms of its corruption. People were murdered around the world. In Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, right, after the Tet Offensive, vast mass graves outside of the city of Hue because people were being murdered in opposition to communism. We weren't fighting for nothing. But whether we were fighting the war, whether fighting a war was the best answer to it, that's very hard to say. Okay? Public opinion never truly, completely wanes, but Americans become more and more disillusioned with the war, particularly after the Tet Offensive in 1968, which the movie, I think, takes place. They don't really point out when it is, but the Frankie Valli song that keeps getting repeated, and it comes out in 1967. So assuming a wedding band is going to be playing popular songs, this is about 1967 or 1968 when these guys are going to war. The period of time then where they are entering the war is perhaps the most disillusioning time for both Americans, 1968 in general, and for soldiers going over there. where instead of trying to conduct a war where you were trying to wear out the North Vietnamese and believing in the cause, a huge number of soldiers are simply trying to survive after 1968. You're there, you have a set amount of time that you are supposed to be there, and I mean, in some cases, you'll go out and shoot your officers if they are going to lead you into what you consider to be a dangerous situation. Which, you know, of course, the soldiers in this are going to have those kind of situations put to them. Okay. Under the Nixon administration, the goal is to simultaneously bring about peace with honor and to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese. But from the 1968 election campaign, Nixon telling the South Vietnamese government not to go along with it. All right, yeah. And so therefore he has something to hide from pretty much the moment that he gets into office. Vietnam colors Watergate from beginning to end. Okay? This is where Nixon's paranoia is ratcheted up. Okay? He expands the war into Cambodia, which, you know, the end result is Kent State. Up the road in Jackson State, the shootings that take place there with the students. The effort grows to pull Americans out of the war and to shove supplies into the war. And, you know, in general, Nixon is fairly successful to this end. But by the time soldiers are pulled out of the war, Watergate has caught up to them. And so, you know, this adds to Americans' disillusions with this period of time. Just incredibly difficult. In the end, we pull our troops out in October of 1973, and it takes 18 months before the war comes to an end with the North Vietnamese occupying South Vietnam. In that period of time, a good 500,000 people end up in re-education camps, tortured. Some of them die. Some of them stay in those camps for a decade or more. Very difficult to leave this behind. In the end, the war never destroys the United States' role as a hegemonic power, but it definitely wrecks our moral leadership in the world. And then when we're given the opportunity to recover that after September 11th, we squander it again by wandering into Iraq. Okay, making up excuses to start a different war. Okay. For the most part, Americans see the war as worth fighting. South Vietnam sees the war as worth our interest that's involved in it. But, you know, Cold War interests are different from colonial interests, are different from a civil war. The war is a cultural earthquake, and the deer hunter itself is a reflection of that. I'll give it to Stephanie.
Thank you. I thought that was really interesting context. I'm an art historian, and I specialize in the late Roman world. So at first glance, I may seem a bit out of place in the discussion of a film set during the Vietnam War. There is, if you listen very carefully, in like the first few minutes of the film, there is a joke that Nick, that Christopher Walken character, makes about Rome, or about gladiators, if you caught it, right? So there, that's my connection. And please notice also that I said a film set during the Vietnam War, and this is a film that just keeps on giving, in my opinion, and I would say I do not view it as a film about the Vietnam War. It is not to me, and you know, the film is the first hour. What you're going to see after is the fallout. But I've watched the first hour 4 times now. I've watched the whole film through, once. What I study fundamentally is how images carry meaning and what we refer to as iconography, which is the symbolism associated with subject matter, and how that subject matter endures and transforms and accumulates symbolic weight. So in the interest of time, I've chosen one small discrete element to talk about in terms of symbolism, and it's something that I think you can, as you watch the remainder of the movie, you can kind of focus in on and maybe pick up some of this, because some of these are details that you wouldn't necessarily notice because there is so much. This is such a dense, visually dense, symbolically dense film. But I'm really interested in how the film draws on what is a very old visual language. And one of the things that struck me about The Deer Hunter is its use of deer and the deer hunt as a recurring image and theme. And the hunt is not simply a plot device in this film. It's one of the oldest recurring images in human visual culture. Deer-like animals appear in prehistoric Paleolithic cave painting, and the narrative that depicts the hunt, that emerges in the prehistoric Neolithic period in wall painting. And so, I view my role in this conversation is to sort of think about how that motif operates symbolically, and why it continues to carry such emotional and cultural weight. And I have an image, Jonathan, if you could put it up. I only brought one. Art historians, we need our crutches. Okay, so there it is. So the image that you're looking at, excuse me, this is from a place called Çatalhöyük, which is in south-central Turkey. And this is a Neolithic wall painting. This is prehistoric. It dates to around 6000 BCE. And the people of Çatalhöyük were not hunter-gatherers. They cultivated wheat, they kept herds, and they lived in a very dense proto-urban settlement. I think at its height, Çatalhöyük had about 9,000 people. And the community prospered in large part through the quarrying and exchange of obsidian, which is a geologic resource that's found in association with volcanoes. And so if you go to Çatalhöyük today, you can see there's a two-headed volcano in the distance. I don't know that it's still active, but it was very much a part of the wealth and livelihood. And yet, right, the deer hunt persists in their imagery long after hunting was no longer necessary for survival. And this, is one of the images. There are many images from Çatalhöyük that include hunt scenes. And you can see, hopefully, the sort of stick-like figures of people and the very large deer that's, in the center. And very simple, but, this is sophisticated in terms of what it means. And it endures. The hunt image, it endures even though they don't need to hunt for survival, right? They have herds. They're a fully agrarian society. But it functions as communal memory. And the deer hunt is a ritualized performance of community cohesion. And that is why it persists and we see it even after. And I will say, in the prehistoric Paleolithic period, we don't have hunt scenes. We do have deer-like animals that appear in cave painting, but they're not with people hunting them. They function in a different way for those who actually needed to hunt to survive. So hunter-gatherers, the animal exists in these sort of more isolated ways, and the images are about those animals. It's not about the narration of the human interaction. But the hunt scenes, they recall a kind of shared past, and through that it sort of stages this collective strength within what is at Çatalhöyük certainly an increasingly complex society. And let's see. So in the Deer Hunter, the deer operate in a strikingly similar way. Across cultures, the hunt signals group cohesion. It signals masculine identity as well, which is something you haven't seen the first hunt scene yet, but you will, and I think you'll understand, and also this idea of domination over nature. But also involved in these hunts, there's vulnerability and mortality, and that exists within a structured system that's governed by rules and ethical codes. And you did hear a beginning of a discussion of one shot. And that will become really clear in the first hunt scene. And that is sort of the ethical key almost to understanding so much about this film. You keep that in mind, and a lot of the language, it sounds like it's muffled and you can't hear it, but they talked about one shot. It came up quite a bit, and it's something that is very important in terms of the ethical code that these individuals, well, really the relationship between the Robert De Niro character, Michael, and the Christopher Walken character, Nick. This is a dialogue that they have, and you want to keep that in mind throughout the film, because it will come back, literally, but throughout the film you'll understand how this code kind of informs certain things about the relationship. I think that the film, it reinforces this hunt imagery through things like the mounted taxidermy deer heads. First time I watched the film, I saw one deer head. Second time I watched the film, I saw that there were 3 deer heads in Michael and Nick's small house. They're everywhere. And you will notice later in the film, the camera stops, it hesitates, it focuses, and you might think, well, what's going on here? Like, why are they focusing on the taxidermy deer head? These are really critical kinds of images. They're, aside from the taxidermy deer heads, we also have these 2 deer hunts. And there's one that you'll see when the film comes back. It's right before their departure for Vietnam. And then there's another after Michael's return to Clairton, Pennsylvania. And the mounted deer heads, they function as a kind of domestic trophy. And no matter what direction the camera's in, you seem to pick up on a deer head. I think there's a bird, a taxidermy bird in there as well, but you see these deer heads. And these are these trophies that are preserving, in a sense, as emblems of what is a controlled violence. And that controlled violence happens within this sort of ethical structure, this moral code that they're following, this one shot. And so it has a particular place. And but I would say, to back up, that like the deer imagery at Çatalhöyük, it transforms the act of killing into a kind of stabilizing symbol within the domestic space. Because the deer hunt that you're looking at here was also in a domestic space. Çatalhöyük is a fascinating place in terms of its architecture and the decoration that we find there. Here, in the film, I should say, the deer marks something even more intimate, and because we are given more context for the film, we don't know about the people who are inhabiting these spaces at Çatalhöyük, but because we know more, we know marks this bond between these 2 men. It goes beyond the 2 men. There's a group of friends, but it really speaks to these 2 men who have known each other since childhood. And there are certain things, if you pick up in the first hour of the movie, there are even some tensions between them that go unspoken. There are things clearly that they let pass in their relationship because of the strong bond. And the hunt, again, will really they've talked about it, you haven't seen them hunt yet, but it kind of defines their friendship, it defines their masculinity, which I do think is an actually really interesting avenue to explore, and also their shared ethical code, again, the discussion of one shot. The film, and I should say, a little spoiler alert, hopefully I'm not spoiling anything for anyone, but the film stages a really profound kind of inversion that you'll see in the second 2 hours. And the deer hunt, the deer hunt, as I think I mentioned earlier, it's ritualized violence, but it's contained within an ethical structure. Russian roulette, which you will see, is also ritualized violence, but it's ritualized violence that's stripped of meaning. And so, think about that as you explore that, if you can keep your eyes on the screen. The one affirms community, right, and the other, it just isolates. So I think the rupture in this film, it's not simply war. It's kind of the collapse of a structure that once made mortality somehow comprehensible, and towards the end of the film, the emblem will really start to feel very hollow for Michael. And there is a scene, again, I apologize if I'm spoiling, but Michael doesn't take, what?
Don't tell us.
Oh, you don't want me to? Okay, so I would say be very mindful in the final hunt scene, after Michael returns from Vietnam, in the way that he approaches One Shot. And I think that rupture will become, very, very clear, because these rituals that once really gave the trophy kind of meaning will sort of collapse through, what happens to him in Vietnam. That's what I wanted to say. I'm going to point out one other detail which I caught sort of on a second run through of a certain section of the film. But towards the very end, and this is not a spoiler, you'll see a white cat. Look out for the white cat. I thought it was something I didn't catch the first time through, but it's a very interesting symbol, because when something like that appears in the film, you think, well, why is the cat there? It has to have meaning. And in fact, what it presages is something that is very disturbing. And the cat, sort of as a symbol or an animal, cats are unpredictable, and the cat is sort of set up almost in a kind of opposition to the deer, the nobility, and that which happens within that sort of ethical structure. So I would say look for that. It's a threshold moment. There are a lot of interesting threshold moments in this film, but that's a really, I think, important one towards the end, in the last few minutes. Maybe it's in the last 10, 20 minutes of the film. But that's it. So, I think watching it with this stuff in mind, look for that hunt imagery, look for the images of the deer, and certainly pay attention to the two hunt scenes, and compare them in your mind. If you pay close attention, and you'll see some really interesting things going on.
That's really interesting. Thank you. I'll definitely watch it with different eyes in the second half here. Thank you. So as I was introduced, my dad is a Vietnam veteran, and he recently had a fall, so we've spent several hours in hospitals and rehab facilities. And I knew this was coming up, and I was like, hey, Dad, do you want to pass some time by watching this movie that I've got to talk about? And he was like, nope. Didn't want to go, didn't want to be there, hated every minute of it, try really hard not to think about it since I've been back, forget it. I was like, okay. That was pretty clear. But while we were sitting there talking, I pulled up a few images on my phone, and we were looking at them, and I was kind of running through some of the ideas that I wanted to talk about. And it was funny, because as soon as the steel mills came up, he's like, oh, that looks like Camel Works, and oh, that looks, blah, 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 and it's ingot cat, all sorts of stuff. And he got really animated, and I was surprised. So we ended up actually having a really nice sort of conversation based in that part of the film. And thinking about it, his dad worked for the steel mills, he worked for the steel mills, and as I think Martha said, my first job out of college, with my creative writing degree, was also in a steel mill with Dad. So between somewhere in the 1940s and through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, someone in my family was working at mostly LTV Steel, but also Republic, J&L, Youngstown Sheet and Tube. We were in most of them at one point or another. So what I want to spend just a few minutes sort of pointing out is a lot of people give a lot of love to the directors of films, and sure, they do a lot. But I often feel that the cinematographer adds just as much in some cases and doesn't get the love. So I want to shout out Vilmos Zsigmond was considered one of the most influential cinematographers of 1970s New Wave American cinema. Rightfully so. He was voted by his colleagues as one of the 10 most influential cinematographers of the time, and this movie in particular was nominated again by a society of cinematographers as one of the 100 milestone films in cinematography of the 20th century. So it is really really interesting, and kind of like Stephanie, I kind of focused on the first part of the film, but there is a rupture, and you'll see very different approach visually in the second half of the film. So when I rewatched this first part, what I really noticed this time was the prevalence of long shots, right? So a long shot, as opposed to like a medium shot or a close-up or an extreme close-up, a long shot showcases the human figure within its environment, right? And then also the moving camera shot There's a lot of still camera shots here, but I was struck at how much the camera pushes into a scene, moving through the space, pulls out through the space, pans across the space, and it really struck me that one of the things that kind of visual approach does is it stresses not just the individual, but the individual within his family, his community, his town, his country, and it provides a context, right? And if you think about it, that's how movie stories get told, through a lot of long shots and medium shots. The real moments of tension come with the closer shots, but those don't have the impact if you don't have the context, the connections between characters in their environments that are built through the long shot, and especially these traveling long shots. And boy, do we see that steel mill in the background of a lot of shots. And if it's not the steel mill in the background, it is the church in the background. Almost every long shot's like, oh, there it is, there it is, there it is. And yeah, and then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the lighting. It is beautiful, and it's very multi-layered. It's cross-directional, so there's lots of different light sources, and that was very, very important to Vilmos Zsigmond, who talks a lot about this film. This is one of his masterpieces, and he talked about what a challenge it was to light some of these night shots running through the streets, right? We want to see the steel mill in the background. How do you light that, right? And particularly in the 1970s, the steel mills were not interested in having a lot of Hollywood lights showing their smokestacks, blowing pollution into the air all night. They were like, yeah, you're not doing that. Forget it. And so they had to be really creative. And so they did a lot of day for night shooting, where what looks like nighttime shots are actually daytime shots with filters and blue lenses. And so the depth of lighting in the outdoor shots is amazing. And then I was really noticing in the church, and definitely in the reception, how many light sources and how many different places within a very deep frame your eye can light on and sort of think. And it's not just our main three guys, right? Like, there are moments where the light picks out all these relatives, all of these community members doing their thing sort of in the background, fully inhabiting this world, as well as our main characters, in a very interesting way. They said that there was Zsigmond said that he wanted to focus a lot on the combination of blue and gold. And right from the first frame within the steel mill, you saw the blue of the night sky coming through and the gold of the molten steel, which apparently was also quite a problem to film, right? Because if you point a camera at a cauldron of molten steel, it's going to blow out everything else. So how do you light that so you get the beautiful glowing steel, but also the actors' faces, the human figure in that context of the steel mill? So once we get to Vietnam, we get a very different look. We don't get as many of those traveling sort of long shots that give us the context, because these are men without a context. And they're trying to find their place, they're trying to find their feet. They don't know what's going on from moment to moment. Even their bonds with each other have started to sort of fragment. And so instead of these sort of rich long shots, we get a much more sort of stationary, we get a lot more close-ups, and the lighting and the color is much, much different. Very much desaturated, sort of muted tones that are meant to look sort of like news footage or documentary footage, to show, again, as Stephanie said, that sort of fragmenting of community, that sort of shattering of the bonds. And so in addition to the symbolic way that Stephanie spoke about, the visuals tell a very similar story, that sort of echo and reinforce that. So things that I would invite you to keep an eye on in the second half are the lights, the colors, and the types of shots that are chosen. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague.
Hello. Before I begin, do we have any combat veterans in the arena today, in the auditorium? Nobody? Wow. Yeah, sorry. Any Vietnam veterans?
You got one up there?
All right, thank you. So I'll tell you why I'm thanking you at the end, but it's a personal thanks. So in the context of the movie, as a historian, I can offer a lot of things. However, what my portion here is to talk about kind of the reality of it. When I was a young man, I watched this movie, and the irony of this, I grew up with a lot of these people. My uncle was a CV who worked in Agent Orange, got an MS along with 14 other men in his platoon, 7 of which passed away because of Agent Orange. I had 3 cousins and 2 other uncles that served in Vietnam. all of them came back, as Dr. Ponte said, changed individuals. When I was a young man and watched this movie the very first time, I was like, wow, it's a war movie. You know, John Wayne, Green Berets, war movie. And I started realizing, what's this movie? It's a wedding. And then something, what just happened? The war's over. And something else happened, like, well, that movie was horrible. Now, I remind you, I was 12 years old, so yes, I was looking for John Wayne and didn't get him. So, after I went through ROTC, came through YSU, earned my PhD, I happened to be in West Point, New York, teaching in the history department when 9/11 happened. Here's the irony. My wife, who's pregnant with our third son, and myself and my other two sons decided we just get to West Point, New York. We're going to walk the streets of New York City and view the towers and everything else. And she was far along in her pregnancy, and we got back at the Grand Central Station. And I said, she goes, do you really want to go down and see the towers right now? I said, nah, honey, we're going to be here for 3 years. Don't worry. They'll still be there. Yes. Well, 2 weeks later, anybody hear the Alan Jackson song, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning? He talks about being in a classroom that September day. That was, at that time, Major Joseph Alessi. There I am on the platform teaching at West Point and world history. And in the room comes one of our majors from the history professor, turn on the TVs. At West Point, you don't turn on the TVs. We turn on the TVs. And as we're watching the TVs, the news goes on that the towers have been hit by a plane. We're like, with a little Cessna or something like that. And then we saw the aftermath. So we literally watched the second plane go into the towers. We walked up to the top of the Thayer building and you could see the smoke coming from the towers. Now, West Point's about 45 minutes away from New York City and you could see the smoke. It was a very sober moment. Well, immediately, phones from units that we had served in started ringing on our boss's desk, General Cody. And so I was called by the 101st Airborne Division, which ironically, the unit he's been serving. And my old boss said, I need you back. We're going first in. We're going to Afghanistan. Like, roger that. Got it. Been training for it all my life, ready to lead men the way I was supposed to lead men, ready to do it. I go into my office, I go to my boss, and I said, sir, you gonna go to general? Because I talked to the general, and the answer is no. I said, sir, he goes, nope, trust me. Now, General Dewey was a Vietnam veteran. And he said, trust me, it'll still be there 4 years from now. And he goes, and trust me, you don't want to run to it. At the time, as a young man, you're like, well, okay, maybe he's got to. He goes, General, because you know how many majors in the United States Army that are airborne ranger qualified and have PhDs? I said, I don't know, half a dozen. He goes, 2, you're one of them. You're not going. You're at West Point. I'm like, got it, boss. So I sat there at West Point training young officers to go to Iraq. And, you know, there you are, a non-combat veteran trying to tell young soldiers what combat's like, from what you understand. Now, prior to this, I've been on a humanitarian relief operation with Haitian and Cuban migrants, and that changed you first. Watching a 5-year-old child die from AIDS in front of you is a difficult thing to watch. And when it happens multiple times, day in, day out, you begin to change your view of what reality is. As, you know, Stephanie said, there's a structure and a reality, a controlled chaos, the war and violence, but it doesn't prepare you to see some of the things that you see. It just doesn't prepare you. Movies don't do it justice. Band of Brothers doesn't do it justice. Some of these more modern warfare films where they show the action and the gore, they really don't do it justice until you're there. It changes and reframes your reality. Like the young men in this film, there I was, a young officer, ready to do my duty for God and country. It was our next Pearl Harbor. It was 9/11. It was Pearl Harbor all over again. And we were ready to do our duty. Several years later, I find myself in Iraq on my first deployment. And the reality was much different. You're not prepared to see what you see. Bodies without heads. Children, like you shouldn't see children. And it changes you. What you realize is not everybody views humanity the way you do. Not everybody shares your morality. And while you're here as a liberator and a bomb will go off, and as U.S. soldiers are moving towards the bomb, Iraqi civilians are coming back, and children are clasping onto your legs because they know that you're safe. But you're going to the sound of it. It changes you. And so, like these young men, you go with this ideal, and then you're thrust into the real and the reality of it all. And then you come to a realization after a while, we weren't just fighting one enemy. We were fighting Saddam Hussein and his leftover regime. We were fighting Osama bin Laden, and we were fighting Jaish al-Mahdi. And believe it or not, we were fighting Iranian special forces who'd been sent into Iraq to fight us because we were Americans, and they wanted to fight us. Before we knew it, we were fighting a forefront war and didn't realize it, and everybody looked like a civilian. We had at our one compound, our security chief, who was an Iraqi, his brother was the lieutenant, the second in command at Jaish al-Mahdi militia in Sadr City. And we formed a relationship with him. One day, he goes, "Joe, don't go out the gate left." Ahmed, what do you mean? He goes, "Don't go left." I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Joe, don't go left." We went out the gate. They said, "Sir, which way are we going?" "Well, we're going right." We came out later. We called EOD, explosive ordnance people. They went out left, and guess what they found? A big V-bid, which is a vehicle-borne ID, in the road. I came back and said, "Ahmed, how'd you know that?" He goes, "My brother." He said, "What do you mean?" He goes, we don't hate you as much as we hate Al-Qaeda. Because we want you to leave, but we want them to leave first. Like, okay. So there's a person working for the United States government watching our fob security whose brother is one of the enemies we're fighting. It's an asymmetrical warfare. And then you realize the reality, being a historian, you don't ever win an asymmetric battlefield. You don't win a cultural war. They will outlast you. They know you're going to leave eventually. And then you get this, I'm just watching the clock. I've got a 12-month deployment. And the first 3 months in, it's really, really nervous. Then you get really numb. And the last 30 days, you get really, really nervous again. Then you come home. Now, the thing is, we were in and out, in and out, in and out. But you do come back, and you come back changed because you're not ready for what you see over there. And that's what happens to these men. You do get survivor's remorse. You feel bad that you came back and your buddies didn't. Or you came back whole and your buddy didn't come back whole. And you'll see some of these things in the movie later on. In a time when Americans were not necessarily the friendliest towards the United States military because of Vietnam, this film is way ahead of its time to show that aspect of don't hate these servicemen. They thought they were doing everything that God and country and their traditions had told them. If you look at the men that are holding on to the one at the beginning, the VFW guys, they're veterans of foreign war. But part of those guys were World War II, World War I, and Korean War veterans. At the end of the movie, you'll see them reappear again in another capacity. The community itself doesn't necessarily hate you. They may dislike the idea of the war and those things. And this is one of the very first films that is almost in an apologetic way saying, don't hate the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who served. And so it is actually really way ahead of its time for that reason. Why I think Vietnam veterans every time and Korean veterans is because the way that they were treated when they came home was the exact opposite how I was treated. I could not buy a meal for weeks. If I was anywhere in a uniform, I'd go to pay and I'd, no, you're covered. Well, who? No, your tip's covered too, you're good. And it's that sense of community that we see in the movie that in military bases, it's a completely different thing. Fort Carson, Fort Benning, it's a known military community. And they welcome you back, arms wide open. I look at this movie completely different now. And the movie, when I looked at it, I'm going, this is horrible. I'm like, wow, I get it now. Thank you.
I want to thank the whole group and all of you for listening to us. If there are any questions, we'll take a couple very quickly. Okay, I don't hear it. Oh, yeah.
With the French that had the
Hold on one second, he's gonna give you a microphone.
Wait.
That's a microphone.
Oh,
Speaking to the
I was going to
audience.
ask, the French had that, they were the colonizer, and their whole rubber for their tires were, Michelin's were all sourced there. That's where their rubber was, that's where their wealth came from. And also they treated Vietnamese so badly, if there was a downturn in the economy or something, they took more from them to give more to the French people.
Yeah.
And that was very bad. But then later on, the Chinese got involved and the Russians. Everybody was using that as a way to train or see how good their weapons were or what. Mm-hmm. So it was very strange what was the action. And then the South Vietnamese, since they were having all these people work for them, like the Americans, they decided they weren't going to fight that much. They weren't going to put themselves in danger. And then all the times when all those tunnels were there, why didn't we know about all those tunnels? And that's, to me, a lot of the planning in the military, crazy.
Yeah.
That's all.
I said military intelligence is a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else?
Just right behind you, sir.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you. When I saw that there was going to be a panel, I leaned back to my friends and I said, geez, if we don't talk much, this will be over quickly. And I'm thinking, this is not what I need, in the middle of the movie, 5 people discussing it. And I just got to tell you, I was very wrong in that thought. I find each one of you more interesting
Thank you.
than the other, and very balanced, very objective, and gave me a lot more insight into the music. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate your comment. Professors usually get a bad rap as boring.
Especially history professor.
One last question?
Art films are
You got one in the back.
back.
Oh, okay.
Mr. John, everybody.
I don't have a question, but just a comment that it's very good to hear Stephanie Smith talk again. I was an art history major and sat in several of her classes, and when I saw her down there, I was very excited. And as usual, her commentary was spot on, so thanks, Steph.
Thanks, John.
Okay, thank you very much. And with no more ado, I think we're back to the movie.
I also wanted to say thank you for all of our staff and our